Login accepted.
We're going to be getting started with our Windows Week. Very, very exciting. I'm going to start off by honoring our fallen teammate, Tanai. He's still alive. He just retired from the team. He was the main person doing Windows last year. And he made a lot of this PowerPoint, so I very much appreciate that. Hi, I'm Dylan. My teammates also call me Mike sometimes. Last year I did Windows with Tanai, and this year I'm captain, and very tired right now because last night at 2 a.m. I was at a climbing gym in Long Beach watching the Olympics. So I slept for about 2 hours. All right, so today for this presentation, we're going to be going over a couple core Windows topics. We're going to be talking about navigating, interacting with the operating system in general. I know a lot of people use Windows a lot, but there's a lot of important things that you probably aren't aware about just from a daily use basis that we need to cover. We're going to talk about Active Directory, which is Windows credential management, like domain system. We're going to be talking about other services on Windows, as well as the homework finally. So for navigating, the first thing is to differentiate. It's really important to differentiate the GUI from the CLI, which is the graphic user interface, versus the command line interface. Windows, as opposed to Linux, has pretty extensive graphic user interface features. A lot of the server and system management can be done through the GUI. On Windows, it's a lot easier for most people to interact with. There's a search menu, so you can find most of the menus you need for Windows Defense and Windows system configuration pretty easy, and it's a lot more beginner friendly. The CLI, in this case, the modern one that is more easy to use, PowerShell, is pretty simple on Windows. It's made to be a pretty readable and easily understandable language. It's not just a command line interface, it's also an object-oriented language, and pretty much every important thing within the Windows operating system and core Windows services can be interacted with through PowerShell as objects, as you would just any objects in an object-oriented language. It's very nice. It's very, very extensive, and it's also a very efficient way to get things done if you spend time to learn it. There's also just the normal command line on Windows, which is outdated, but is a lot more consistent because between different versions, because they are kind of constantly updating PowerShell with new features. So a new feature on, let's say, Windows Server 2022, this version of PowerShell, if you try to run that same script, run that same command on, like, let's say, Windows 2012 server, might not work. So yeah, the normal command line is good for that. So more about PowerShell. PowerShell is constantly being actively developed. Pretty much every new Windows Server version comes out with some new features and updates to PowerShell, which is why there's varying versions on different operating systems. The language is really easy to use for the most part because all the commands or most of the commands are formatted with verb noun syntax. So it's what you want to, it's basically every command is what you want to do and what you want to do it to. So like get child item gets a child item of some item. Set content, pretty self-explanatory. Invoke expression is a way to invoke scripts. So it's pretty clear what commands are doing when you run them. It's also directly integrated with the Windows API. So like I mentioned earlier, you can manage and interact with pretty much anything in the Windows operating system as if they're objects in an object-oriented language. You can get objects, you can manipulate them, their values, you can filter for specific parameters in the objects. So it's very nice to script with for automation. So some GUI panes we're going to be talking about that are really important to you. Regedit is where all the registry keys in Windows are accessible and located. We'll get to that later. File Explorer, you probably know what this is, but we'll talk a little bit more in depth about the file system. Computer management or account management.msc has a lot of important information like scheduled tasks, event viewer, shared folders, so like SMB shares, and local users. Services has a list of all the services running or not running, disabled or enabled on the Windows system. Control panel is generally a good way to access most of these things from one centralized location. And then there's Task Manager, where you can see processes currently running, or with Server Manager, the roles and features currently installed on a Windows server. This last one, Server Manager, isn't available on a host like workstation OSs like Windows 10, Windows 10 Home, Windows 10 Enterprise. They're only on Windows Server versions. There's also Windows Security, Windows Defender. Most people just use it for its base antivirus properties, where it can like see a file that it knows is suspicious and it tells you that it's a virus. But not super important for CCDC, but there's actually a lot of really cool security features that Windows Defender has, especially like Enterprise Edition, where it can function. It functions as a pretty solid SIM. And then there's a GP Edit, which is for editing group policies. All right, so first for regedit, this is pretty important. Pretty much all the operating system configurations in Windows, as well as also configurations for things not directly tied to the operating system, can be edited or changed through the registry. Yeah, most configurations link back to a registry key. Basically, it's a like tree hierarchy of different keys that are nested within each other, and you can assign values to these keys, and the values and locations of these keys can affect how the computer works. So for instance, you could change a key that changes the language used by the Windows host. You could change a key that decides how what kind of authentication protocol Windows uses. There's a lot of like, pretty much you can control most of the configuration of Windows through the registry. It can be modified through the command line interface, so you can write PowerShell scripts to change things within the registry to automate that or access it faster than clicking through the graphic interface. But it can also be utilized by threat actors for persistence. For instance, there's specific keys that if you set their value equal to a executable, it will run that executable every time the host starts up. So threat actors might put their malware in that registry to make it automatically start every time you launch your computer. The file system, similar to Linux, holds all data on the computer. It's a tree structure. It's a little bit different the way that you navigate it from Linux. For instance, you access, generally you refer to directories by their drive. So you always start with the drive that the files are located in. So all the examples here are on the C drive, and then it also uses backslashes instead of forward slashes. And the last important thing is, unlike Linux, Windows is not case sensitive. So if you do C / lowercase Windows / lowercase system32, it's gonna bring you to the exact same place as if it was all capitals or whatever, which you can't really do on Linux. Some important paths to know are system32 has all the important system binaries and libraries. That's why when you delete it, your computer doesn't work. Users has just all the user files. So all the, basically every user has their own like desktop downloads, like images, like directories. Those are all located per user in the user directory. And then program files and program data hold all the binaries, libraries, and configuration files for applications that are not related to the system. There's also really configurable permissions for the Windows file system compared to Linux. Instead of files just having like read, write, execute, there's a lot more specific things you can do in terms of like group policies and group access to certain files, or who can access certain directories, which means when managing Linux file permissions through the command line, it's actually a lot more complicated than changing them on Linux. So generally, I don't like using the command line just because the syntax is very not fun to use. But luckily, there is a GUI that you can use to manage file permissions. Computer management is a GUI pane that sort of lists a lot of core management functions within Windows. For instance, it will have a list of local users, so you can, from a security standpoint, audit the users on the system, make sure they're all correct, make sure people have the right permissions. You can view SMB shares, which are a type of file share where you can directly access file systems on other Windows computers. You can see all these shares through computer management. You can look at scheduled tasks, which also, like the registry, may be used to set persistence for malware. For instance, someone might have a scheduled task that runs like a beacon every time you open up a certain application, or something that's a little bit more uncommon or less common than just having it run on startup. So that might be another place where people can hide automated activities like starting up a malware, or also like just basically automating any function that an attacker or like normal system admin might want to do. The event viewer also can be used to troubleshoot issues and identify malicious activity. On Windows, a lot of stuff is logged as Windows events. So for instance, like user login attempts, occasionally like applications using certain libraries and APIs, all can be logged as Windows events that you can go and search through and query through computer management in the event viewer. So this example, 4625 is the ID for events that indicate failed login attempts. 7045 is for services created events. Yeah, it's a pretty good way to monitor activity on a system. For services, when I'm talking about services here, we're talking about the service pane, which is used to manage and view services on your Windows computer. This is a little bit different from services as a concept in general, which are just like applications that users access on a computer. Specifically, this pane is a way to manage binaries that are designated to run constantly in the background to perform some sort of core functionality. For instance, FileZilla servers would probably be listed as in the services pane. BitLocker is a native drive encryption functionality that's native to Windows and will be in services. So a little bit different from just launching an executable and running it as a process, because it's more core to the function of the server itself. Services are identified by two things: either their display name, which is a little bit longer but very simple and clear to understand, and they also have a service name, which is usually easier to access when interacting through the command line to identify them. There's some commonly exploited services it might be useful to get to know, to just stop on systems. Not like super important, but definitely look into that, like Prince Spooler. And some attacks and privilege escalation make use of temporary services to be able to basically execute code as a system user, which will be tracked differently by a lot of like security agents and security systems on Windows than a user mode program. The control panel has a lot of important things in it. It's where you can interact with the firewall GUI to enable, create firewall rules for different services or ports or whatever. It can be used to manage whether remote desktop is enabled, which definitely you don't want to have on if you're not using it, because that can be a pretty big access point. It can be used to enable user accounts to control, to be able to have different permissions for executing programs or controlling in different ways. And it's also, as you all probably know from the network week, is where you access the network adapter properties to do things like set your computer's IP, set its gateway for your different network adapters. For processes, there's a lot of different ways you can monitor them on Windows. Task Manager is the most commonly known one. Just type it into your search bar, it'll pop up and it will show you all the processes running on your machine. Usually they're separated into two separate groups. So there's apps like Discord or Google Chrome, or things that you've installed and are using. on your computer. And there's also system binaries, which are processes that are core to Windows functionality that are not user spawn processes. So you can use Task Manager mostly just to create and also end processes. But it also has a lot of important information that you can access, like the process ID, which is a good way to identify an individual process because there might be multiple with the same name. And just different like analytics about the processes running, like who created them, how long you've been running for, etc. And yeah, there's a bunch of different types of processes. Like I said, there's apps, which can be terminated by the user. There's background processes that are just kind of handling things in the background. And then there's like Windows system level processes, which are automatically handled by the Windows OS. There's a lot of alternatives to Task Manager, though. For instance, you can interact with PowerShell in the command line to get the same information that you would be able to see in Task Manager about the different processes, which can be really good for, like I said, automation with scripts. There's Process Hacker, which is sort of like a third-party alternative to Task Manager, which is a lot more thorough and detailed if you need more information on your screen about the processes running. And there's my favorite, which is Process Explorer, which is color-coded. It's pretty similar to Process Hacker. It's, I believe, acquired by Windows and supported by like Microsoft now. And it can also has this really cool feature where you can link it up with a VirusTotal database and be able to compare all the hashes of all the processes running with their database of known malicious software. So you can see how likely different unknown processes are to be malicious just on comparing their static signatures, which is pretty cool. Finally, on server, you have Server Manager. Like I said, only available on Windows Server editions. So like Windows 10 Home would not have this. It's not like super useful, but it can allow you to pretty easily install like Microsoft supported services like IIS, web pages, Microsoft like DNS, Microsoft certificate services, stuff like that. And the main purpose is just having easy access to GUI panes to manage, install, and delete those like core Microsoft services. Windows Defender or Microsoft Defender installed is by default on pretty much every Microsoft system except a few. It can be uninstalled on server editions through Server Manager. You can also kind of kill it or get rid of it on other Windows editions, but it's really hard. The effectiveness of Defender kind of depends on the version running. For instance, you might have an old version that's just comparing static signatures of files on your machine to known viruses, but then you also might have like a newer enterprise version of Defender, which is like tracking like Windows ETW events and seeing like what suspicious libraries certain applications are calling, and you can sort of use it as a SIM and like filter through it with like SQL or KQL queries. So yeah, the version of Defender really matters for its effectiveness. But mostly it just sort of automatically scans and remediates potentially malicious files on your system. GPEdit, the group policy editor, is basically a way to control security specific operating system policies by groups. Basically, you can assign different users to different user groups in Windows. And then based on those groups, those different users can have different permissions and ability to do different things on the system based on which groups they're members of. And this can be like really granular. This can allow you, for instance, to, what was a good example? Like, for instance, you might want to have one group that has to change their password like every 2 weeks, or you might, and you want to have another group only have to change their password like every few months, or there's a lot of better examples that I can't think of off the top of my head, but it's like very granular control of how you can edit and change how different users interact in your Windows Server environment or in your Active Directory environment. Oh my gosh, this died. Oh my God. Is this still audible? Oh boy. The cube is charging, you said? It should be. I have to go to my laptop.
It's using the notes.
That's not charged. I'll just use my laptop. Unless. All right, can everyone hear? Can everyone hear me? Awesome, we can keep going. All right, so like I was saying, hopefully my microphone hasn't been out for too long, but just basically talking about group policies. It's a way to manage essentially and requirements that different users and different user groups have to meet in order to like interact with the Windows operating system, what permissions they have to do on different hosts, etc. It's pretty granular, and you can see, you can just look in your GP edit yourself or look at Windows documentation on what settings you can change for different groups. All right, now on to the second part, Active Directory. Yeah, so Windows has a lot of security and configuration management features for individual hosts, but the core advantage of using Windows generally, as opposed to Linux for like a server environment, is the Active Directory. So I'll get to that a little bit more in depth. Basically, it's a way to centralize management of policies, computers, users, and store all those things in a single database so that no matter what system you're logging into or using in a Windows domain, you can use the same accounts and have your security policies apply universally everywhere. Essentially, Active Directory is a like credential management database. So for instance, that is how your CPP login works everywhere. You have a single account, but all the different services you can authenticate to with the same account. That's how Active Directory works. You can use a single Active Directory account to log into any hosts connected to the domain and do whatever you want on those systems. There's also forests, which are collections of domains within Windows Active Directory. And then within those domains, there's possibly child domains. It can get pretty expansive. Basically, what a forest is it's just a container of multiple domains, like I said. And domains generally in Windows are controlled by domain controllers. So these are like high-level Windows servers that are primarily used just to manage security and group policy and authentication for a Windows domain holistically. You can have multiple domain controllers on a domain. A lot of the times that's better because you want to have backups and redundancy in case your main domain controller goes down and you just switch to something else. And member servers, which are domain joined and are connected to a domain controller, are subject to group policy settings and management from the domain controller. Within domains, you have basically an extension. It's basically, think of it as like a higher level extension of the individual like Windows hosts policies and like security settings. So you have organizational units. You have Windows domain groups, which are different from local groups. You have Windows domain users, which as opposed to local users that can only access a single system, these domain users are allowed to, you can log into a domain account from any machine on a Windows domain. So yeah, every domain joined computer. And there's also just a lot of miscellaneous Active Directory data that exists in Windows domains. Lightweight directory access protocol, LDAP, can query any and all information pretty quickly. You can use any sort of LDAP client, such as dedicated programs. A lot of internal Windows tools use LDAP. PowerShell uses LDAP. Basically, a lot of ways to authenticate within a domain. Oh boy, I love this. Yeah, so this is a really good example of how PowerShell can really simplify a lot of the stuff in Active Directory. As you can see at the top, there's this crazy filter prompt that you can use to sort of look through different groups and users in an Active Directory to look for ones that have certain properties. or you could just do the very simplified, nice, easy to use PowerShell query at the bottom. So that's a pretty good example of how PowerShell makes things, makes interacting with the Windows operating system and Windows Active Directory a lot more simple and straightforward than it would be otherwise. So now we're talking about how Active Directory actually lets you manage computers within the domain. So like I said, you can use an Active Directory account, Active Directory users to log into any computers, and they have synced policies. So basically, all the member servers will request updated group policies from the domain controller every so often, and the domain controller will send them those policies and will regularly update to make sure that the entire Windows domain has consistent security policies across it. You can deploy these policies manually through GPMC. There's a default domain policy, generally, which applies to all systems in the domain. And then there's also a domain controller policy, which applies to all DCs. So the first one would be like all member servers, and the second one would be specifically for domain controllers. How it does this is through, or how a lot of the interaction between computers and Windows servers works within a Windows domain is through WinRM. It's enabled by default when you join a domain. It allows communication directly between different Windows machines. It's basically how a lot of the behind the scenes management for Active Directory actually goes on. So it's important to have that running for your domain to be working. But there's a specific setting within WinRM called PS remoting that's really useful. From a security standpoint, it allows you to run PowerShell commands remotely across domains. So for instance, you could use PS remoting to deploy the same security script across every single Windows machine on a domain. So it's a really powerful tool within Windows Active Directory for like IT and general management. Yeah, so by default, servers for PS remoting will only, or servers for WinRM will only accept connections originating within the domain and from administrator users. So WinRM is, like I said, kind of handles the background communication and internal communication between servers in a Windows domain. It's enabled by default. It's required for the domain to function, but PS remoting isn't. And by enabling it, you can interact with the machines in the domain, authenticate from them from outside of the domain, so from outside of the network, and deploy scripts, deploy commands that you want, basically do whatever you want. Really good for managing a ton of systems all at once and like really quickly. Domain names. On a domain, the way that you identify different hosts on the system is when you domain join a computer to a domain, you assign it a specific name or identifier. So basically, it is a single identity attached to an IP. I'm not sure if y'all have gone over what DNS generally is yet, but essentially the way that you hit sites or you hit domains within a Windows domain by a name and not their IP address is that you'll have some sort of database of IPs and their correlated names, so that when you try to access something through its name as opposed to its IP address, it goes to the DNS service. It says, do we have an IP address correlated with this name? If it does, it'll send you to that IP. So that's the way that domains work. Domain names work generally, as well as within Windows Active Directory. The cool thing about Windows Active Directory is it automatically updates and manages domain name changes and correlates them to changing IPs. So you might have a dynamic IP on your machine, like you don't have it assigned to a static one. But if it's in a domain and that IP changes, the DNS will automatically update to have that new IP, so you can still access it through the same name. Yeah, at the bottom here is just some examples of DNS servers, like Google's popular DNS server 8.8.8.8. It's just a pretty common public DNS that's used for accessing the internet. And DNS generally uses UDP, not TCP for domain queries. So when you're writing, like for instance, firewall rules related to DNS, you want to have those rules set for the UDP protocol, not TCP. Oh, actually, really quickly, this is also why when managing and setting up firewalls within a Windows domain, it's important to have DNS allowed, because otherwise you can't hit other servers in the domain through their domain name. It can make stuff a little bit harder to work with. So generally, that's why in a functioning domain, you want to have a DNS enabled or led through the firewall, at least locally within the internal network. All right, so for authentication, Windows historically has had two main authentication methods. There's NTLM and there's Kerberos. NTLM is the old one. It's not very secure. It's pretty easy to crack NTLM hashes, and there's a lot of ways to sort of get past it, but it's what's generally used locally on machines for local users. It's a network authentication protocol, and it's way more prone to cracking than what Windows Domain uses, which is Kerberos. Kerberos uses the concept of tickets. So basically, if you haven't taken like a cryptography course, it's when authentication for a specific connection is tied to basically a time gate. So you authenticate to a system, and then you get a ticket for a certain duration or a lifetime, in this case, 10 hours. And then authentication is valid for that time. And then once that runs out, you have to re-authenticate to the server to connect. And these tickets are derived from a like algorithmic combination of the user's password for the domain. And also there's a KRB-TGT like domain account with a set password that's also used for this process. So for instance, changing the account password for KRB-TGT too many times, because I can explain this more in depth if anyone has questions, can break Windows domain authentication, because if all the machines don't have the same KRB-TGT password, they can't correctly generate the tickets from the combination of the user password, and they will no longer be able to authenticate and function within the domain. All right, so this is a pretty high-level explanation of how authentication using like time-gated tickets works. Basically, in this example, it'd be similar to showing a QR code at a gate to get into somewhere. Because if you show that QR code, you get a wristband, and you can show that wristband at booths, because that wristband, because you got it from showing you the QR code, proves that you're allowed to like engage with the activities, right? And then you can do stuff within the event. That's similar to how authentication works, where you do the initial authentication, and then you're given the ticket to access and interact with the domain network for a certain amount of time, and basically do whatever you need to. But after a certain amount of time, like I said, there is a time gate, so it will eventually expire, and you will have to re-authenticate to continue to interact with the network. All right, now we'll talk about other services. These are just generally some services that you'll probably see on Windows servers. A lot of these can be managed through IIS and have like Microsoft supported versions that you can install. FTP, generally on port 21 or port 20, is stands for File Transfer Protocol. It's basically a file sharing service that you can use to transfer files and data between machines. There's a passive mode, where basically the client or the computer connecting to the file server will dictate which of these ports are used to do data transfer. There's also an active mode, which honestly I can't explain well. And then there's different ways that it's been implemented. So it's all a single protocol, but there's, for instance, FileZilla FTP, which is a different implementation from the Windows IIS FTP that you get through installing it through the Windows Server Manager. And they have to be managed differently. Managing FileZilla requires its own GUI, as opposed to the Windows version. So it's pretty important to be somewhat familiar with all the versions. And FTP clients sort of natively exist on nearly every operating system. Windows, just type FTP in the CLI, and you should be able to use it to access file servers. Yeah, from pretty much any host. It just comes by default. All right, we're going to be talking about SMB now, which is Server Message Block. It basically is a Windows service that allows you to connect to file systems on other computers. By default, for instance, servers will have the entire C drive shared as a SMB share. So you could theoretically mount the C drive of another computer on a Windows domain, or just one that you have access to your own host system to be able to access it as if it was part of your own file system. There's a lot of fun APIs exposed during SMB connections. And SMB is how the pretty famous Eternal Blue exploit works. So there's definitely a lot of security concerns when it comes to SMB, so it's important to make sure it's running on a correct version on your environment, or if you're not using it at all, it's just disabled. All right, so now we'll talk about IIS, which is the web server that's built into Windows. It's basically a role that you have to add. It doesn't come by default, but you can install it through the Windows Server Manager, and it supports .NET. You can also configure it for PHP or just like other scripting languages to use. And it's pretty plain out of the box. I think 2 of the web servers on your networking week were on IIS, just basic HTML services. If you want to do more complicated things in IIS, like for instance, like WordPress, there's a lot of like features and plugins you have to add to get it to work. So it's pretty bare bones with its base installation. XAMPP is another popular web server service on Windows. It's basically a pre-configured sort of web stack. It comes with all the different parts of a basic web framework. So it comes with like Apache to serve HTTP. It comes with MySQL for its database. It comes with FileZilla for file shares. And Tomcat is also a way to serve HTTP, but it's kind of worse because it's written in Java, or at least according to Tanai. I haven't done a ton with Tomcat, but generally in XAMPP, the servers will be using Apache as opposed to Tomcat. Oh my gosh. There's also content management systems. So for instance, these are the apps that run on these like web server frameworks. So WordPress, OpenCart, Drupal, MediaWiki, basically any sort of apps or sites that run on these web servers. You kind of set them up. They all sort of have the same base setup where you have HTTP serving the actual like network access to the site. So like I said, would be like Apache, like IIS, etc. And you have a scripting engine, which renders the actual appearance and functionality of the web page. So that could be PHP, that could be like JavaScript, that could be basically any scripting language that is used for web. And then you'd also generally have a database that's hosting all of the like long-term user information for a site, like what posts there are, just anything that is not directly core to the content and format of a site, but you do want to have long-term storage for, would be in a database. So like I said, Apache, XAMPP comes with all these applications installed. And so you can set up a database, a scripting engine, and HTTP all at once, and sort of have a working web app from one sort of management perspective. Generally, these files go in the web root. I think that's like inetpub / like www. Database would be set up separately through its own service. MySQL is its own database service. And then you basically just have to configure the web app to be able to hit the database and authenticate to it, and then you'd have a functioning web server. Something going wrong? Uh-oh. All right. I'll be available to answer questions for the next 2 or so hours. I know that was kind of just like a big information dump. But the homework is pretty guided, I think, and it should give you a good introduction into interacting with the Windows operating system. I kind of have it in reverse order, but I recommend starting with the second part first. It's going to be 2 try hack me rooms that should give you a pretty decent introduction to basic like Windows configuration and like IT, as well as Active Directory. And then from there, there's 2 questions that you can answer. One is on setting up a Windows host firewall, and the other one's on, I believe, oh gosh, I don't remember. Anyways, that's a link for the homework. So yeah, have fun with that, and I will definitely be free to answer any questions about Windows. Gosh, what did I put here?
Sorry, I'm actually going to take away this link really quick just to remind myself. Well, ah. All right, the other question is about registry keys. Okay, that makes sense. Gosh, I'm quite tired.
So it's just like it's like